built in your company's work from home policy. Julie, you ready to go?
Yes, ma'am. Can everybody hear me clearly? I'm hoping so. Um, so first of all, thank you everyone for taking the time out today to attend. I sincerely appreciate it, and we'll jump right into it. Just one more thing, this session will be recorded. So if any of you miss it, or if any of your colleagues are interested in viewing this session, you can always catch it on our website or on any of our social media channels. I believe it will be posted eventually on those forums as well. So having said that, let's just jump right into the reason why we're gathered today. So designing a work from home policy. And I thought I'd start off with a small little humorous thing. And this is a situation that most of us, for the better part of this year, have not had the luxury of partaking in terms of catching a flight to go someplace. But when we do eventually get into that availability, in terms of being able to travel and you're heading off to that sunny destination for a vacation, I'm hoping that this is definitely not a work from home scenario that you'll need to face or be, hear that PA announcement when you're comfortably settling in, thinking of sunny shores and sunny skies. Um, so today we'll be covering overall in the context of business, why we need to set up something called the work from home policy, look at who's eligible from a workplace standpoint. Keep in mind, not all workplaces are able to set up a work from home policy. We'll also talk about how to set it up in terms of equipment, data security. There's also information security in terms of your business's proprietary information, as well as your client data. Um, Making your policy available and how to communicate it to your employees at large. We'll look at considerations on workspace, health and safety, and related items. We'll also talk about how to support your employees who are working from home. We'll give you some tips in terms of working from home. We'll provide you with a quick checklist in terms of what it is that you need to look out for. Evaluating the policy, any expectations and deliverables that you should be sort of considering as you set up the policy and operate it on a go-forward basis. And then we'll look at risk considerations that you'll need to look at before you sort of embark on this brief journey to set up a policy. Overall, looking at why we need it, it's pretty clear that it seems to be the future of remote working. Most importantly, businesses should consider if they can operate on a work from home basis, as opposed to should we do it. Obviously that makes sense, simply because not all businesses can be operated on a work from home basis, like the sort of comic relief example we saw right off the bat when we started this presentation. Also, there's considerations of accountability. Many times I hear in conversation with clients, as well as in my past career, work from home almost becomes sort of a euphemism for, oh yeah, you're working from home, or are you slacking off from home, kind of thing. But that's not the case, and we'll see why as we go along this presentation. If you set up a proper policy, that is. We'll look at what benefits the work from home policy setup and rollout will provide to businesses. Keep in mind, we want to retain employees and support their well-being, while at the same time ensure that business deliverables are being met. Also, we'll explore a little bit of, considering that remote collaboration requires a bit of a different skill set when it comes to setting up and operating a work from home scenario on a long-term basis. How to set up a structure in terms of boosting productivity and business continuity, and not sort of a knee-jerk reaction to something that has happened during work from home, but being proactive about it and being ahead of the curve, if you will, in setting up that policy. The policy itself sort of also gives you basis to set up sort of a brief accountability framework, and you'll hear that word quite a bit in the course of this presentation. So accountability is pretty key in terms of setting up the policy. It also sets up logistics, yes, but primarily rules in terms of what responsibilities are for the employee, responsibilities are for the employer as well. Any of the other issues that sort of come up. We'll also look at how this can be, huge cost savings to business overhead and employee commute and things like that. And one of the other things that we'll sort of look at briefly is this concept of BCP DRP. And for those that are not familiar with the BCP DRP, we'll look at BCPs typically are business continuity plans, and DRPs are disaster recovery plans. So typically, a disaster recovery plan is what do we do as a business if disaster strikes? So that typically comes first. So a DRP typically leads into a longer term business continuity. So now that we've recovered reasonably from a disaster or whatever unfortunate event that may have sort of struck the business, how do we continue? Can we continue our business for our clients, for our employees, and for the profitability, well-being, and operational stability of the business over the long term? So if you have BCP DRP, we won't be discussing BCPs and DRPs in this particular presentation in detail, but if you already have one, setting up a work from home policy can easily be you can leverage your BCP and DRP to sort of set up the work from home policy if you already have a BCP and a DRP. So having said that, we'll look next at eligibility and approvals. So we talked about this before in terms of not everyone can work from home. Setting up something in paper creates sort of a point of reference, a basis, a code of practice, if you will, for your employees in terms of long-term sustainability of the particular plan. And one of the key starting points is to look at sort of who in your workplace will be eligible or qualify, if you will, to take advantage of a work from home scenario. So it's important to distinguish internally before you even start publicly talking about work from home policies, to distinguish the positions. And this can be done easily among yourselves as business owners or with the conjunction of your in-house HR representative. Just it's a common sense sort of approach in terms of distinguishing which positions you can sort of reasonably operate on a work from home basis and those that you can reasonably support on a work from home basis. We've talked about this briefly before in terms of some companies simply don't have functions that are conducive, so especially if you have manufacturing where you have big machinery or specialized equipment, that is not a scenario where you will be able to reasonably sort of work from home. Also, in terms of what's mandatory, so in the case of COVID, over the last, I want to say 9-10 months now, it's been almost mandatory for some of our businesses based on your regional lockdown rules or business closures or things like that. It's been almost mandatory to work from home for those businesses that can. And we've seen how the government's been able to set up sort of reasonable supports over the last little while. Not all of us may be happy with what they've done, but they're doing the best they can in the circumstances, considering it's a bit unprecedented for all of us over the last 9 to 10 months. So figuring out what's mandatory and what's not, can we reasonably do it? And then creating sort of a clear process with roles attached to those processes in terms of requesting and approvals and setup and operation of the work from home policy on a go-forward basis. So it's a lot of sort of details, and it sounds like, oh, it's pretty straightforward. We can just roll out a policy and it'll be fun. But as you can tell, there's a lot of detail that goes into setting up a documented policy in terms of work from home. And this then creates a point of reference, as I said, and a code of practice in terms of what works, what doesn't work, what do we need to tweak going forward, and what acknowledgements we need from employees on a sign back basis and things like that. Overall, it's fairly important to have how should I put this, an unambiguous policy. There's no need to sort of go into great detail. Sometimes the less said is better. Sometimes you may need to go into a little more sort of explanation. You need to be able to engage your senior leaders. It's impossible to actually operate a work from home if you don't have a sort of a capable middle management team, because at the end of the day, this is your front line that will hold accountability, maintain that accountability, show leadership, and sort of check up on your employees on a day-over-day basis in terms of the job function that they perform, and safeguard any sort of, or remind employees in terms of any safeguards they need to have in place or setting up and things like that. We'll start off next with talking about setting up just basically from a policy standpoint as well as from a real world setup standpoint. So now that we've sort of embarked on creating this policy framework, if you will, what goes into that policy? The very first thing you would look at, other than sort of the responsibility considerations, um, and this is what I mean by responsibility considerations is general responsibilities. We haven't yet talked about accountability and performance management and things like that, and we'll get to that. But other than sort of the general responsibilities, employees do this, managers do this, uh, a business should look at technology. So first of all, one of the things that we faced as a business, we're talking about Beneplan now, is remote logging in. So do you have a server on site where your employees will need to access your data? Is your email available offline or through Microsoft's remote server or any other email system that you're using? Can they log in without having to sort of log into your company's network? Things like that. Will you be issuing laptops to the employees that you you will sort of authorize to work from home? The care of those laptops, will you be providing any sort of chairs, desks? We've even looked at businesses, and this is from a past career standpoint. Businesses have even provided printers, scanners, things like that, mobile phones. Is the expectation that the employee will use their own mobile phone? Will the company pay for some of this? Um, or how all those items will sort of work in terms of logistics, care, and damage liability. These are important considerations, especially if you are actually going to be buying and dispensing company equipment, if you will, to the larger employee population from a work from home concept. Uh, the other thing we need to look at also is data security. So, what the employee can and cannot do. Do you have rules when it comes to printing at home? Keep in mind there's a bit of invisibility. So, is the employee allowed to print from home? Is the employee allowed to copy pieces of data to their personal computer if they're using remote desktop on their own machine? What types of setups will you allow? Confidentiality of client information again goes back to what they'll be allowed to print, what they'll be not allowed to access, things like that. Will they be required to periodically come into the office to perform certain functions? And so overall, this sort of creates a basis, if you will, a rule book in terms of what will and will not take place in the context of work from home. One of the other things that we did not sort of note here is the whole context of will this be sort of a hybrid situation where the employee can work from home on 2 days a week or 3 days a week, or will they be working from the office for the most time, but they can work from home on a as needed basis with prior notification? One of the other things is, will this be a short term concept or will this be long term? So a lot of businesses, even prior to COVID, were already working towards a permanent, if you will, work from home context. And this is true for some of the larger organizations that I've worked at, the banks, larger corporations in terms of saving real estate and things like that. The concept of hoteling stations come to mind, where if you need to come to the office, you book your hoteling station, you come in and you set it up, and that's pretty much it. Again, this will not be able to be set up in manufacturing environments, but most manufacturing environments also have sort of an admin section as well. And depending on how large the admin population is, and whether they share the space with the manufacturing area or if they occupy an office building somewhere else, uh, this could be a very important aspect to consider in terms of long-term or short-term work from home. Um, so large businesses, as we were saying before, were already looking at work from home as a solution to mitigate some of these business costs, if you will. With COVID, it's been more a necessity piece in terms of working from home. But more conversations I have, and the conversations I've already had over the last few months, as we hopefully get to the end of the year and hopefully a close to COVID season, if you will, what I'm hearing more and more is the probability that businesses will continue this context of work from home. And I've been getting questions on, what should I be considering, and Should I be doing this? Should I not be doing this? In terms of data security, what can I do? How do I manage these employees? How do I hold accountability and things like that? So these are some of the things that sort of need to be documented in a rule book. Most companies, keep in mind, already have employment policies in place. So there's no need to sort of reinvent the wheel. Your work from home policy can reference the existing policies you have in the context of a work from home scenario. You know, Accountability framework pieces like behavior, respect in the workplace, things like that. So there's no need to sort of restate everything in the policy. One of the things we'll be doing for attendees of this particular presentation is we'll be emailing all of the attendees a sample work from home policy. For those clients that have already taken advantage, Beneplan clients who have already taken advantage of this and have a copy of this, the feedback I've gotten is it's a fairly robust policy. It's something that I sort of put together to benefit our clients. It is indeed fairly robust. I believe it's about 8 pages. You don't necessarily need to keep all the 8 pages. You can take what you need, glean from it what you sort of want to implement for your own policy, and you can remove the pieces that you don't think apply to your scope of business. So that's something that you'll be receiving free at the end of the presentation, either tomorrow or day after. It will be emailed to you as sort of a free giveaway um, for attending the session today. So you'll see that the policy that we send you will cover all of these things, and it goes into some fairly detailed aspects. So it's not necessary that you should keep each and every one of those aspects, but it's a good point of consideration, to kind of spur your thought process if you haven't thought of anything. The other sort of secondary piece to look at when it comes to work from home policy is the trust, communication, and availability of your employees. We talked briefly about sort of the invisibility of employees when they're working from home. Are they working, are they walking down the park, or are they actually sitting at their desks? Now, and this has always been sort of a bone of contention. The general context is people who come to work, 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day, they are at work, and so they must be hard workers. Well, my career has sort of taught me that that's not necessarily the case. There's been many situations where employees can spend 10 hours at work and not really do any productive work. Meanwhile, you can get a lot done, even if you're not at work. Um, a little bit of peace and quiet. You don't have disturbances. You don't have coworker distractions or other distractions in the office environment. And so there's different variations. I'm not saying that the rule applies to every single context, but the old sort of way of thinking that you have to be in an office environment to be able to do productive work is not necessarily the norm. The other thing to consider is that your employees in most businesses are sort of the foundation blocks of your business. They are the ones who are client facing. They, produce the widgets for you, whatever it is your company is manufacturing, whether it's a service or whether it's a physical product. Your employees are the people that actually get, the rubber hits the road kind of thing. And that's the point where the rubber hits the road for business. So this is sort of a true test of, trust and relationship building between you as owner operators, managers, leaders of businesses, and the employees who conduct the work for you on a day over day basis. Yeah. Having said that, one of the things you'll also hear in this presentation is documentation. Document everything. Yes, you do want to build trust and relationship, but be clear on what it is your expectations are. And that goes to the documentation of the policy of, setting up very clearly what the hours of work are going to be, um, what needs to be adhered to. Is it going to be a standard workplace? Are you going to actually provide special permission? Maybe I cannot log in at 9 a.m. for whatever reason. And is it okay if I work, 10 to 6 as opposed to working 8 to 4? Will you offer flexibility on when and where work can be done? So do I absolutely need to be in my home? Or is it okay if I take a break and go to my cousin's place who lives down the street and work from there for a week or two, or whatever the case is, depending on what the situation is? Outline how responsive your team needs to be. So, if you send a message on, let's say, an instant messaging tool, and we'll talk about those very briefly. How soon do you expect a response? Does it need to be right away? If you send an email, how quickly do you expect a response? Um, what channels of communication should they be using, in terms of phone, email, messenger, establishing the accountability and productivity measures for each respective jobs. So this is not something that you would include in your policy per se in terms of the accountability and productivity for the job scope. This is something that we referenced before where this will already exist and you're just referencing it. This will already exist from before and you're just sort of reinforcing that in terms of accountability and productivity and measuring those and time spent on projects and cases and things like that. Also, the expectation of setting up virtual chats. So I've always professed this as a best practice in the course of doing business. Um, Set up a meeting. It's easy to walk down the office to find your coworker or your direct report or your manager and talk to them because they're just in the office down the hallway. In a work from home scenario, it becomes important to schedule these sort of virtual chats, similar to what we're doing now in terms of video conferencing or over the phone or whatever the venue is, or even using a chat messenger program or things like that. Um, and having a check-in with your employee to sort of summarize what the work week looked like, deliverables, gaps, things like that. It's always a best practice to summarize your conversation in a very brief email and send that through. And I'll talk about it again down the line when we look at performance management, because that's a very effective way of sort of not just keeping connected, but also keeping a pulse on things and performance management aspects. The message below, you'll see the picture in terms of Slack. It is a tool that we use as a company, and many other companies use it as an effective business tool um, when they are requiring sort of a messenger online. Um, it provides instantaneous sort of contact with other team members who are also online. You need a quick answer. You typically reach over your cubicle and talk to them. This sort of offers that virtual cubicle reach over and sort of say hello and or just let somebody know that you're going to be going on lunch or whatever the case is, and you'll be back right away, or you have a quick question to ask. So it's a very important sort of tool, one of the many very important tools in making work from home a very sort of normalized or conducive way of keeping in touch with your team and your colleagues at large, even though they may physically not be sharing the same space as you while they're working from home. The next thing we will sort of talk about briefly is the workspace itself. The policy document in terms of work from home has a copious amount of information in terms of focus on this particular aspect. In terms of outlining what a distraction-free and hazard-free workspace looks like. This is very, very important simply because um, the, the obligation for maintaining a safe environment does not sort of end. Yes, the employer does not have control over the private residence of the employee, but it is still sort of obligatory to say, to sort of reinforce health and safety in the workspace, so to speak, to ensure that there's not any absenteeism or injuries or things like that when employees are working from home. Keep in mind the WSIB coverage that most employers have does extend to employees as long as they're in the course of employment. So it does not remove responsibility. However, there is a piece in OSHA, I believe it's section 3.1 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act of Ontario, that says as long as the work is permitted, the work is done by occupant in a private residence, and if it's done regularly in the context of work, it can be sort of covered. However, there has been sort of cases where the courts in general, and this is more from a federal standpoint, where if it's a private residence, there's no sort of expectation that the employer is going to be responsible for an injury that happens in a private residence. But if it's something that occurs on a regular basis, it's always a best practice to sort of communicate with your employees the best practices in terms of setting up a hazard-free workspace. It is also key to, I want to say, in the work from home policy, to designate what the responsibilities are for the employer and what the responsibilities are for the employee, and what the employer is not going to be liable for. So, you've communicated as the employer best practices. You've linked them to the Occupational Health and Safety, the WSIB website for Ontario. You've communicated on a regular basis the need for health and safety and hazard-free workspace. You reiterated in your periodic meetings with your employee who's working from home, and something happens, unfortunately, and they injure themselves. It's sort of key to put in your policy that any sort of injury that arises from that, because the employer does not have control or visibility to the employee's workspace, it's very important to outline in your work from home policy that the employer is not going to be liable or responsible for it, for that particular injury. Um, you may need to report it to the WSIB, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will result in sort of liability for the employer. Of course, you're still going to have to deal with, depending on if the employees, hopefully not badly, but if the employee is injured, things like that, you'll have to deal with the sort of fallout of that injury and time off and things like that. But it is something that is fairly important to address so you can avoid that scenario altogether. So the last statement in this particular slide, it's always good practice to have a work from home agreement signed. So communicating, and we'll talk about communicating and rollout briefly, but having that acknowledgement from your employee, specifically when it comes to a work from home policy, specifically when it comes to key risk aspects, and this is one of those risk aspects when it comes to work from home, um, to ensure that they understand their own responsibility, and to ensure that a setup is not something that's going to be taken lightly from a work from home scenario, is key to sort of minimizing liability from an employer standpoint. Now, many times there has been, and it happens in many workspaces where employees need to temporarily take time off because I'm taking care of a sick relative. Even during COVID times, employees have not been able to come to work because they have a quote unquote at-risk person at home. Now, having an at-risk person who's not sick is one thing, but if you're taking sort of, I want to say, permission from your employer to work from home because you have a dependent that you're looking after, this is not necessarily good practice. So it's important to remind your team about the whole distraction-free workspace, and not having interruptions, the impacts of it on productivity, the impacts of it on the mental health of the employee themselves, their ability to focus on the job. All of these things, details, get impacted, and we don't consider them at face value, but they're very, very important in terms of looking at this dependent care thing. So if I take a leave of absence, I'll lose my full salary. So I'm going to ask my employer if I can work from home for a week, 2 weeks, maybe even longer. Unfortunately, that shouldn't be. While the road to hell, they say, is paved with good intention. So while the intention, if you will, is good in possibly allowing employees to work from home while they care for somebody, it is not in the best interest of the employee themselves, and neither is it in the best interest of the employer. And ultimately, there is a reason why we have protected leave of absences in the ESA, varying periods of time for varying reasons, including dependent care, and as well for self-care as well. So it is definitely key to sort of highlight that, and sort of suss out why the employee is looking for a work from home scenario, unless of course it's an employer mandated piece, and that's entirely a different context. So I'm not saying that there should not be compromise. At the end of the day, keep in mind what we've already sort of covered in terms of the accountability framework, and we'll still be talking about that in detail in terms of performance management. But keep in mind the responsibility piece, keep in mind what's involved in setting up the work from home. And most importantly, as the employer, you'll need to keep in mind that you're going to set up a precedent, because if you do it for this one employee, you're going to have to do it for others. And that's when the equity and being fair across the board to your other employee population will be sort of critical if you do it for one person and not somebody else. And you'll unnecessarily have a complaint about, discrimination or things to that nature. So supporting your work from home employees looks, different in sort of varying scenarios, but ultimately, the whole context is, and assuming that all things being equal, and you've sort of set up a policy looking at all of the logistical and physical and technological aspects that we've sort of briefly discussed. It's all about creating trust and documenting everything at the same time. However, but having that open-ended conversation with your employees, allowing the two-way chat, um, not creating this I don't want to disturb my manager context. It's perfectly okay because during business hours it's perfectly okay for you to sort of quote unquote disturb me. That's the reason why I'm here as your manager, and that's the reason why we expect accountability from our employees. It avoids the disconnection piece, the open-ended communication, and sort of implementation of some of the tools that we've talked about in terms of the phones or messenger apps, or email systems or things like that. Avoids that feeling of oh, I don't know what Joel's doing because I haven't talked to Joel in almost a week and a half now. And yeah, he's supposed to be working from home. So that's not sort of a scenario that we want to sort of look at. Identifying mental health support. So as part of your group benefits with Beneplan, most employers sort of have XAP, I believe it's called. It's made up of three parts from an employer standpoint, but in most benefits plans, they do have an EAP program, or employers have an independent EAP program where they offer mental health support. So it's important at times like this, especially the last 10 months, where there's been a huge impact on mental health because of isolation, because of lack of connectivity, just the tediousness of being by yourself for majority of the day, things like that. There's a lot of people who've had, unfortunately, to resort to support. So it's important and key. This is not one of those things that you want to advertise to your employer, or it's easy to speak about. So it's key as the employer to sort of identify these, to say, hey, just wanted to let you know that these supports are available to you if you should need them, and then to disseminate information. So one of the things we did yesterday on our messenger app Slack, myself and one of our coworkers, we researched what the city of Toronto's resources were for mental health support, what the province of Ontario supports were for mental health, and a few items from CAMH and the Canadian um, Mental Health Association and things like that. And we sort of sent web links within the messenger chat just as an FYI if you need them, and some sort of public interest articles that we came across in the media, Toronto Star and things like that, that sort of talked about the mental health impacts and things like that. So there's awareness. You don't feel alone. Your employees feel supported from that context. And I purposefully spent a bit of extra time on that topic simply because, keep in mind, if we don't sort of do something to nip these aspects in the bud, if you will, these can have repercussions in the long term. So next year, hopefully, when things are sort of back to normal and everybody's back at work, you can, sort of experience, why is this person taking time off now? Because the repercussions of these particular types of ailments are long term, and they're not immediately sort of visible or obvious. So you want to sort of provide that support and identify the support early on, so that people can get the help they need when they can actually use it, as opposed to trying to fix the problem when the problem has manifested to a bigger issue. So overall, having clear policies and processes obviously is very clear, not just from identifying what supports you provide for your employees, but even from who's going to do what, how we expect this thing to operate, this thing meaning the work from home concept, how we expect it to sort of run, and what we will do. It's not just about outlining the policies, but what will happen if things don't work the way we expect them to work. And that brings us to the sort of the next little pictogram there, which is continuous risk assessment. So rolling out the policy doesn't mean, yeah, we rolled it out, yes, it's successful, and we'll hope that nothing goes wrong with the whole context, but assessing it over a periodic basis, just to make sure that things are working the way they're supposed to, doing a bit of technological risk assessment, security risk assessment, data management risk assessment, and as well the piece about the personal risk assessment for your employees in terms of mental health, how they're doing, and ensuring that, overall work-life balance happens. Um, I'm pretty sure many people on the call and as well others will identify with this context. But for me, many times, I'm thinking that it's not yet 5 o'clock or it's not yet 6 o'clock or whatever the case is. And I'm busy working and I'm caught up in accomplishing something before end of day today. And I look at my clock or I look at my wristwatch and it's 8 p.m. and I haven't had a break and I'm working continuously. So, sort of managing and ensuring that there's the work from home work life balance in attending to family and taking time off and things like that is also very, very crucial. It's perfectly okay if you're working till 8 o'clock because you didn't log in till around 11 or till noon, if your workplace allows that. But if you started working at 8 a.m. and it's 8 p.m. and you still haven't sort of signed off officially for the day, over time, that can be fairly problematic. So some of the tips that you can share, and there's tons of information about this, and we'll be sharing this in sort of articles over the next little while. So watch out for the tips and sort of related scenario information that you can share with your employees in terms of best practices for working from home on our website, beneplan.ca. But we'll be sharing these in articles over the next little while. So just in general, having a designated workplace, so that way you're not bouncing around from A to B to C, and you know that that's your space, and you tell your family members that that's your sort of sacred space in terms of workspace, if you will, and there's no interruptions and distractions and things like that. Ensuring that ergonomics are met, you're not resorting to slouching or whatever the case is in terms of posture. Um, so this sort of ties back to the health and safety standards as well, beginning and finishing at the same time every day, so you have a sort of a routine set up, and that way you're not encroaching on family time um, as a best practice, and that sort of ties back to mental health, and which also can become a work from home WSIB issue in terms of workplace health. Being meticulous with your schedule, establishing a routine with that schedule in terms of meetings, regular contact with your peers, regular contact with direct reports, regular contacts with managers. That's important. So it's not necessary that it's just the managers that set up meetings with their employees. Sure, nominal workspace, I might not have ever talked to my manager or gone over. But because it's a work from home scenario, I think it would be best practice just even tie out for, I don't know, 10 minutes per day. You don't have to speak every single day, but even 10 minutes per week or 10 minutes every 2 weeks to say, hey, how's it going? The last 10 days, here's what is accomplished, here's what's done, and here's what needs to still get done, kind of thing. Um, Creating boundaries with your families or friends in terms of for employees as well as for managers who work from home in terms of what types of interruptions are okay and what's not. Keep in mind, reasonably try to mirror what you do at work. If your family has an emergency, they would call you on your mobile to let you know. So yes, they can come by, and yes, you're only working in the basement or you're working upstairs or whatever the case is, and they can always run in, but sort of create a boundary so you don't have constant interruptions. And again, the reiteration of being honest with yourself as an employer, and as well getting your employees to be honest with themselves in terms of, making sure that teleworking is not a substitute for um, childcare or elder care, or, I just want to save on commuting costs, so therefore I want to work from home. That's not typically a good enough reason. So very quickly, in terms of a policy checklist, we've covered most of it, but outlining what types of jobs or tasks may be done at home, making sure that there's a statement about regular terms and conditions of employment in terms of an employment contract that you have in place before, ensuring that those remain the same. Arrangements for normal supervision. So this is where you would engage your managers in terms of setting up and ensuring that they have a code of practice, if you will, in how they're going to interact with employees who are setting up and working from home, and how that's going to continue uninterrupted. Good practice to always identify where exactly would be the preferred work from home scenario, and any contact details in terms of email address, phone number, and setting up that availability piece that we talked about before. a statement on a requirement for the employee to follow all company health and safety policies. Where will meetings be held? The requirement for the employee to come into the office, communication and between work from home teams and customers, how that's going to occur, any reimbursements if you have any, and how those are going to occur, and what you'll pay for and what you won't pay for, and the requirement for the employee to be at the office when requested, and they're not going to refuse your. And again, keep in mind, be reasonable with this. You can't call them in the morning and say, I need you to be office within half an hour kind of thing. But being reasonable in terms of expectation of being at the office, and how will overtime work if there's any claims or overtime, and a statement on how that's going to be looked at. And storing proprietary information in terms of what the expectation is of the employee. Rolling out the policy and communication should be fairly straightforward. So know your audience, what are you going to say to your managers? What are you going to say to your employees, and how will it be communicated? A morning meeting, things like that. So getting your leaders buy-in into the policy itself to ensure smooth operation. Do a pilot, find 2 or 3 employees and get them to test run the work from home, see if it works. If it works for those 2 or 3 people, the good likelihood and good chance is that it will be successful across the board for your larger employee population. Gathering data from the pilot, look at the feasibility and rectify any issues that pop up from that. And then communicating in a group meeting or in your morning meeting verbally before you roll it out. In some cases, of course, you may not be able to roll it out, but having sort of a group chat, especially during COVID, where we just suddenly some businesses was sort of cold turkey over a weekend, effective Monday, starting to work from home or things like that. But web conferences can sort of rectify that. Communicating that verbally, and you can communicate the policy itself in a subsequent email officially as with documentation and information, asking for a sign back, leaving the door open for questions, if you will, in terms of ongoing evaluation of the policy, ensuring that you have sort of a protocol to not necessarily let your employees know beforehand, but letting them know that we will evaluate it periodically. We're not going to tell you when, but there will be an evaluation of the policy in terms of making sure things are working the way we expect them to work. And then the last thing is, of course, getting a sign back acknowledgement from the employees once you've rolled it out. It's key to evaluate the policies. We've talked about this before in terms of every 6 months. It's also good. You don't necessarily need to communicate this to your staff if it doesn't apply to them, but if stuff that applies to them in terms of criteria that you'll be using to evaluate the arrangement needs to be communicated to your staff, simply because if you're canceling the arrangement, I think it's fair. Yes, you can do it as an employer, but it's fair to sort of let your employees know why you're canceling the arrangement and what things don't work and what criteria you use to evaluate whether they worked or they not. And some of the evaluation criteria may include things like business goals and metrics, your overall employee well-being, meeting deadlines, the communication with the employee, the productivity that the employee is sort of displaying over a period of time, availability when you call them or you message them, and how quickly they respond, attending of meetings, things like that. The level of customer service for those of you who have employees who will be working from home but talking to customers directly. That's one of the big pieces of feedback you can get is from your customers in terms of availability of your employees for your customers. And then the other thing is any accidents, injuries, or risk events that have been reported to managers. And sort of the notification in your policy that these should be identified and reported to managers immediately as soon as they happen, and not sort of try to be brushed under the carpet or hidden away or whatever the case is. So it is indeed a two-way street. So it's important to sort of look at these as the risk entails. Overall expectations and deliverables from an employer standpoint. So an employer can institute, reasonable policies. Just don't make it harsh, if you will. And employees, for the most part, if you have reasonable policies, employees who wish to partake of work from home or who are working from home have very limited ability to refuse any reasonable practices. There's no Canadian law against instituting changes to productivity measures. So you may want to tweak productivity a little bit just because it's a work from home scenario, whatever the case is, make it a tiny bit easier or have a bit of allowance. Or, you're saving on commute time or whatever, and we expect a little bit more from you. But as long as employees are fully informed and aware and sort of in general agreement on how these measures are going to work in conjunction with the supports you would provide your staff. There's also no law to require employees to have their work monitored from home. So, and this specifically speaks to, every single time you log in, whether you use your own computer or if you're using a web conference, we'll be recording all of your online sessions, chats, things like that. So there is no requirement. It's sort of, there's sort of gray areas in terms of confidentiality and reasonable privacy and things like that. So having sort of foresight, if you will, in figuring out who needs to be monitored, having those conversations with employees who need to be monitored, and then sort of setting up the best practice or setting up a code of practice in terms of what exactly you'll be monitoring, the criteria, if you will, in terms of what exactly you'll be looking for in terms of monitoring. And of course, we go into these environments and setups in terms of work from home with the general notion that not everybody is going to need the monitoring. It's sort of your record keeping, your details, your notes that will sort of decide whether this person is going to need monitoring or not. And it's going to be based on an accountability framework in terms of timelines, touch points, feedback, and any continuous improvement that needs to be done. And in general, there has been various points of research that shows that productivity actually increases when employees are not necessarily in the office. And the decision to work is a choice that they have, and people work more hours, people do better. Why? Because they're in a more comfortable work environment. It's their home, so they're willing to give you 110%, where previously it was only 100. Um, in the broad scope of things, performance management is one of the key aspects and performance management doesn't necessarily apply to people who are quote unquote not doing their jobs. It's the overall aspect of holding accountability and responsibility on both ends, managers and employees. So talking to in the work from home policy itself, just briefly, you don't need to make it super detailed. Keep in mind you have other expectations, nominal business practices. So just sort of outlining and pointing to the fact that we will still hold accountability and responsibility. There'll be touch points. Video is going to be preferred over phone. There will be a follow-up by email. These are things you can put in your work from home policy. Setting up what diligence is going to occur. So the touch base points, what needs to be covered, what will be discussed during touch points and key projects. You don't need to go into every single person's job details, but just outlining that there will be an expectation that the employee will attend the touch points and voice any concerns with their manager when given an opportunity. There will be touch points for weak performers, increasing those touch points and identifying very clearly the scope of challenges in a verbal as well as in a documented manner. Stating concerns, so using video conferencing to allow control of tone and communication. These are some of the tools that you can use to manage employees that require the extra piece of management, things like that. Documenting any no improvement. So again, that documenting piece is very, very key if you need to go down another path. And that path is going to be discussed in a couple of bullet points down there. But documenting any no improvement and considering an actual PIP, performance improvement plan. You can always communicate that by email, ensuring sort of an effective setup of what that PIP management is going to look like in terms of regular communicating and reviewing aspects of the PIP that need to be worked on. So it's very, very important to make that follow-up, to reiterate points that you've said and email what you've sort of discussed with the employee, because it creates a point of reference for documentation. And it, of course, depends on the nature of the work that is being done. It also maintains proof of the interactions and will set up a basis if, unfortunately, if you need to terminate employees down the path, if that sort of comes to it. Your HR person in-house, if you have one, can assist you with it. Any other person who does HR functions can obviously give me a shout, and I can sort of assist with what needs to be done on a best practices basis in managing employees. It sort of sets expectations across the board and maintains uniformity across the board. You're using the same rule for everybody who's working from home, and there's no accusations of discrimination or you treat me differently from someone else or things like that. Using Outlook Calendar is a key tool to keeping in touch with your employees. And then the last thing is sort of termination letters. So how do I deliver? I've already helped, unfortunately, not due to performance reasons, but just because employers are not able to bring people back because of COVID reasons or things like that. How do I deliver a termination letter in a remote setting? So, calling the person, having a conversation on the day off, advising them of what's going to happen effective today, and then telling them that they'll be receiving an email with the termination letter attached in PDF. So please don't email termination letters in Word format. Make sure that you PDF them. Emailing that termination letter in PDF, and then actually physically registered mailing a copy of that letter to the employee's home. So there's evidence of the letter being delivered. Emailed, as you know, doesn't necessarily work, especially if it bounces or things like that. These sort of identify the general reasons why a company or business should look at implementing work from home, dealing with just overall well-being, loyalty, talent management, and costs related items in terms of benefits to the business overall. And they set up a basis for one of the reasons why you should consider work from home. And lastly, we'll sort of cover risks. We talked about the DRP. Consider that if you don't have one, as well as a BCP. You also need to sort of look at adapting and transitioning the processes you have currently in an office setting to work from home in terms of how you're going to do it for new hires, virtual onboarding, performance management, and exits. Rights, yours, the employees, roles and responsibilities and accountability, stuff we've already sort of discussed. Overall, the technical and logistical risks, as outlined in terms of cybersecurity and data privacy and related items. For payroll, tax implications, expenses. Are you going to be issuing a T2200 form because the employee wants to claim their primary residence, an office in their primary residence for tax purposes, things like that? Any reimbursements that you'll provide to employees? Accurate timekeeping, hours of work, making clear that working off the clock is strictly prohibited. General well-being, work-life balance, mental health. We've talked about all of these things, but this sort of gives you sort of a one-page bullet point of what you need to consider in terms of risk. Adherence to ESA, avoiding discrimination. We've talked about that in a couple of different contexts, and compliance with other company policies. And then ultimately, if you're not sure, if you have access to a lawyer, of course, feel free to contact your lawyer in terms of any specific items that we haven't discussed today. If you don't have a lawyer, we can refer you with one. You can also call me to sort of, rub ideas together to see if they sort of work, and I can provide you with some insight on other things you may not have looked at. Overall, strong leadership within the organization is a must, and you have to support your staff in the long term. Keep in mind, it is a two-way street. It's not just about, getting things from your employees. It's also about you supporting your staff. And that sort of wraps it up for the presentation. I want to thank everybody once again for attending. And now we'll sort of take any questions if there are any questions. Erin?
So no questions in the Q&A so far, but if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask live, feel free to hit the raise hand button and I can let you speak. Sounds like you were pretty thorough, Joel. If anybody does come up with questions, you can also always reach out, just like Joel said, at hr@beneplan.ca and check in with him if they come up as you kind of process. Thank you all. We have a question.
Erin, there's a question. Sorry.
Yes, just popped up. What if an employee decides to move to another city 3+ hours away from the office? Can we prohibit?
So obviously you cannot prohibit somebody from moving to another city. The equation that you'll need to sort of look at is, right now they may have moved to another city. Explore with the employee if this is a temporary move or if it's a long-term permanent move, and what the employment relationship is going to look like in the long term. So come 2021, when you're ready to bring everybody back to the office, if that's what your business is deciding to do as a business, how is this employee going to come in and fulfill their obligations to be in the office? So that is something that you should explore in document with your employee to determine how they're going to be transiting 3 hours plus one way on a regular basis, and how you're going to expect them to perform their work if you're going to set up a work from home scenario for them with that 3-hour commute. So your question there, Josie, in terms of can you prohibit, you couldn't prohibit the move. You know, people are free to move wherever they want. What you can look at is the feasibility of the employer-employee relationship and explore the feasibility of that and take action subsequently with regards to that.
We have another question that appears to have popped up in our chat here. So if I have a work from home policy with an employee, but I want them to come to the office, should we need them for a meeting or something in the office, can I write that as a clause in the policy?
Yes, so in the sample policy that you will be receiving from us, there is a clear statement that outlines that the expectation. So one of the statements you'll notice in the policy is work from home is not a right. It is a perk of employment offered by the employer to the employee. So that's the very first. So that sort of sets the tone and prefaces across the board the context of work from home as an instrument for effectively conducting your business. To the specific question, yes, further on down in terms of interactivity with your employees, the expectation is that for the most part, or whatever the schedule is you can adhere to in terms of working from home, for the most part, that will be the schedule. However, based on business needs and with reasonable notice, and that can be in brackets, you can say 24 hours, there will be an expectation that employees are required to attend the office if there's a requirement from your manager or the business operation side of things, ownership, that they attend the office for whatever reason.
Great. So far, that's all the questions. If anybody has a last minute something they'd like to check on, please feel free to pop it in the Q&A or in the chat.
Maybe we give it 30 seconds to see if there's any other questions.
We'll give them another minute.
Okay, the time is 11:05. If you do have any other questions, my coordinates are available to you. It's very simple. It's hr@beneplan.ca, so feel free to shoot me an email anytime, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that come out of this or any other HR questions that you might have, and I'll be happy to answer them for you on the side.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and hopefully we'll speak to you at our next event. Thanks so much.
Have a good day, everybody. Enjoy the week. Cheers.
Thanks.